this morning. I'm always floored when people see something with my name on it and actually want to come hear me talk about things. So thank you for being here. So what does preservation mean to you? You all had the opportunity to answer this question this morning on your name tags, and I'll tell you what mine says. Hold on, I have to check. It says, what do you want to preserve? And I said all of the Black landmarks. And the reason I said that is because preservation for me growing up meant Monticello, it meant UVA, it meant Rugby Road, it meant Jamestown, it meant Colonial Williamsburg, but it did not mean my community. And so what I'm going to talk to you today is how I got into this field and why I believe preservation is the key to answering some of our culture's most critical problems, how preservation can be used to bring us together, and how preservation is actually less about the past and more about the future. So come along this little journey with me. My foray into public history and architectural history and historic preservation started in spring 2011. I was a junior or a third year here at UVA, and I was taking a class with Lewis Nelson called Art and Cultures of the Slave South. He was co-leading that class with Maury McInnes, who was an art historian, and Lewis Nelson is an architectural historian. And their interests came together to teach us about the material culture of plantations. We learned about enslaved people and the landscapes that they inhabited. We learned about the spaces that they occupied on plantations. We learned about all of the things that represent their lifestyles, things like vessels and buildings and workspaces and living spaces and all of the records associated with African American life and history. So on one spring morning, we took a field trip to Clover Plantation, which for those of you unfamiliar with our local area is a plantation about 9 miles northeast of where we're currently sitting, and it is 1 mile away from my grandparents' house. And we went on this field trip to learn a little bit about the material culture. The woman leading our tour was Sarah Lee Barnes, who works here in the library system, and she was talking about her ancestors and their house and the artifacts associated with the enslaved community. As part of the class, we learned about the craftsmanship of enslaved laborers, and we were looking for those things at Cloverfields, things similar to the work of Thomas Day, who was a freedman in North Carolina and created a very unique style of architecture that came to symbolize wealth and social status in the North Carolina Piedmont. So we learned about him, and we learned to look for things that differentiated the craftsmanship of enslaved people from the dominant styles of the time. And on this particular day, we went to see the difference between how enslaved people were living and how people in the big house were living. We went to see differences in the craftsmanship of enslaved spaces versus the big house. We went to see differences in designs by enslaved laborers and enslaved craftsmen and other people. So these are all examples. I'm using the pointer if you can see the little red dot. Are things that Thomas Day created in North Carolina, but are similar to the ways that enslaved people across the United States impacted dominant material culture and aesthetics. And these are all examples of things that we saw in North Carolina, not as part of that class, but at a later date, but are still representative of what we were studying. So back to Cloverfields. On that day, we took a field trip, and we packed a bunch of kids on a bus. I think it was a 55-person bus. It was a really large lecture class. They invited us to get on very early one morning, and I kind of grumbled about it. I was not happy about this field trip. I grew up in Charlottesville. This is my hometown. I've driven past Cloverfields many, many times. And I was like, okay, great. I know it's there. It's a big house, whatever. But I'll go because it's part of my grade, so let's do this. So I sat with one of my sorority sisters on the bus, and we kind of were not doing what we should have been doing, but we were at least somewhat paying attention. And we walked around all of the grounds of this plantation after we arrived. And Sarah was talking about her ancestors, and then she spoke about the use of these spaces, about workspaces like the smokehouse and the kitchens and the dairy and other structures that are still extant at Cloverfields. It's a really great example of a plantation landscape. So we were looking for things like this. This is the smokehouse, and the other picture is the interior of the smokehouse. We're looking at mortise and tenon joints and construction types, and riven wood, which is all great, bricks and sticks, traditional preservation, architectural history. And that was all well and good. We probably did that for about an hour and change, walking around this plantation landscape, before we made it to something that really caught my eye. Sarah Lee had taken us around the plantation, but the last space to see was the big house. And we entered through the basement. And we came in through the basement door, and Sarah Lee reached behind her and closed the door. And this was the first thing that I saw on the wall behind Sarah Lee Barnes. This woman is my aunt. This is Eloise Lorraine Carr Bates. I knew her my entire childhood. She died in 2016. And I thought to myself, oh my God, why is there a picture of my aunt in this plantation house basement? What is this? And this picture was part of a larger collage of people who worked to support Clover fields in freedom in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. And they had all of these photographs. And the more I looked, the more people I saw who looked like me, the more people I recognized from my community growing up, the more faces I associated with my family tree. And I was like, wait a minute. I thought this was a class field trip to just look at some plantation architecture and go on back to class. And now I have all these questions. How had I spent my entire childhood sitting on this front porch at the feet of my grandmother in the foreground and listened to her talk about Sismont and Keswick and not understood this connection between her community and Clover fields? How had I listened to her cousin, or I'm sorry, her sister-in-law, speak next door about their community, which they lovingly refer to as Scuffletown? What did it mean that they were proud to be associated with domestic labor at these sites? What did it mean that they were proud to be friends with these families who still owned former plantations, that they were proud to say they knew them? What did it mean that they could look at these former plantation sites and say, your grandfather built that, your great-grandfather built that? You know, what was that like? And how do we start telling those stories? And then I wondered how I could look at the built environment in Keswick and Sismont and miss all of the information about these men. And give me 1 second, I actually have to look at the names of them, but I think it's important to read their names. The men in the photo, my grandfather is far right. From left to right are Walter Johnson Sr., Willie Bowles, Junior Johnson, Jeannie Carr, and Otto Bates Sr. These men built many of the buildings in Keswick and Sismont, many of the newer structures on these former plantations. They built the hand-dug wells that sustained these families. They built the stone gates at the end of their driveways that blocked them off to the world. They built all of the communities that surround these former plantations, and I didn't know anything about them. I grew up not knowing that this was their contribution to our built landscape. And so then I thought, what do people understand when they hear Keswick? What does that bring up? And I'm sure many of you are sitting here thinking, oh, that's Castle Hill or Keswick Vineyards. Or if you Google Keswick, this is exactly what you see. These are all former plantations. Everyone understands that part of Keswick. Everyone associates this part of Keswick with being beautiful, with being historic, with being iconic and important. And then, if you look at the historic district, that idea is reinforced. So all of Keswick is part of a historic district called the Southwest Mountains Rural Historic District. It includes all of these former plantations along Route 22 into Keswick. It includes all of the former plantations on the backside of the Southwest Mountains on Route 20 towards Barbersville. It does not include, if you're looking at these boundaries and going, that looks like kind of a weird shape. And I bet you can guess what's going on here. These are the historic African American communities developed after emancipation, during Reconstruction, and throughout Jim Crow, and they are not part of that historic district. They don't even have names on this map. No one is looking for that history as part of our historic district. So, after I finished my first degree at UVA, I decided I was going to stay just a little bit longer. So I came back to the School of Architecture, and I worked with Lewis Nelson and Richard Guy Wilson and Claudrina Harold and several other people in looking more critically at what we were doing locally with our historic preservation. So I studied the Southwest Mountains in particular, because I had this personal connection and because I knew there was important history being missed by that historic district. For instance, we missed these two houses constructed by Albert Johnson, who was a freedman but was given property by descendants of Meriwether Lewis and the Randolph family. Those were the people who owned the plantation right across the road called Sismont Manor. And they gave him property, and he used his skills as a carpenter and a master builder to start constructing a community for African American people. If I go back to the previous map, that community is located right here. And Albert Johnson is not included in the historic district. Zion Hill, the church associated with the African American community in Sismont, is not part of that historic district. The other church, St. John, just barely made it into the district, but Zion Hill did not. These are the two largest black churches in this area, in the rural area, aside from the landscape associated with Charlottesville. This is an original receipt for the bell in the church tower, dated 1890 something. And this is my grandparents' house. That front porch that I spent so much time on, not included in that historic district. And so as part of my thesis, I started wondering if there's a structural problem with the way we think about historic preservation. Is it just historic preservation policy to not include these spaces? And I learned that the people who wrote the historic district nomination for the Southwest Mountains were thinking about land conservation. So of course, it made sense to preserve all of these former plantations that were 1,000 acres, 800 acres, 500 acres, because if your goal is land conservation and to protect those spaces from future development, this is a tool that works for you. But there's a clause in developing a historic register nomination that requires 50% landowner approval. And you can probably guess where I'm going with this. Those African American communities would have posed a challenge towards getting this adopted because they would not have understood the formal mechanisms for historic preservation. They would have asked questions about what it meant to have the government, or to have a government distinction on their property, and about the control that they would exert on their own community. And so they were cut out of that district to make the process faster. But also, if you look at the criterion for nomination for a National Register designation or for a historic district, they're very narrow. It's a famous person, a famous event, archaeological potential, spaces that yield research potential, or famous periods of architecture, or famous architects, right? Big A architecture. It is not little a everyday people that are included in that process. And so I started thinking about the ways that we could better, to improve the process, how we can make this process better for nominating people. And then I also thought about, well, if the community is missed, then who else is missed? And I want you to know that all of these photos are from my cousin's family photo album that dates to about 1870. And we've got an unbroken stream of photos from about 1870 to the present. And if their community is missed, then we miss all of this history. We miss the opportunity to get to know these people. We miss the opportunity to see that there are African Americans who are successful in earning money in a rural area, that they are not the stereotypical sharecropping community, that there's something else going on in Virginia and Albemarle County. But if our historic landmarks don't reflect that history, then where do other people get to come into that story? How does the modern generation think about their past when they look back and nothing that represents them is included? If you miss that first generation of people, you also miss these people. You miss the state bowling champs. You miss the exactly. You miss the kids hanging upside down on the monkey bars at the community center built at a former Rosenwald school. You miss the cookouts that take place in those communities. And you miss my mom hanging out with my cousins in my grandma's backyard. So this is why I got into preservation, because we missed all of these people. And this is my entire family at a family reunion 2 years ago. Actually, this is 2015, so 4 years ago. And these are all different branches from individual people who lived in this community. So if we think about the number of African American people in Albemarle County at the end of the Civil War, over 14,000 people, then this is the history that is missed. Amplify this by another 10,000. And that is the number of people not included in the historic district. It has nothing to do with the people who live there historically and everything to do with the people who connect to that place who descend from these communities. And so I don't want to take up too much time this morning, but one of the reasons I got into this field was to tell those stories and to be in control of the narrative around African American history, to correct some of our past failings when it comes to African American history and historic preservation. And I've focused pretty heavily on my thesis in policy. But what I've realized since graduating and going into the field is that it's not just about the policy. It's also about who is doing this work, who already has the background on these communities, who already has the trust from these communities to do this work and to do it well, to go into these communities and document the churches, the cemeteries, the houses, and to collect the oral histories of people descended from these spaces. And I think the answer to that is more diversity in the field of historic preservation. This is a photo of myself, Justin Reed in the center, from whom you heard a quote earlier, and Hannah Scruggs, who works at Montpelier running their Descendants Project, at an African American Museums conference where there were a lot of us, but still too few to do this field justice. And so I implore you today to look around you at the history you see represented in historic markers, at the history you see presented at historic sites, at the history you see addressed by our public monuments and public landscapes. And I invite you to think about the implications that that has for future generations. Are we telling them a full and complete story of who we are as Americans? Are we telling them a story that touches all levels of society, all classes, all races, all sexual orientations, all types of diversity? Are we doing that justice in our public historic landscape? And that's a question I hope to answer every day and work to solve at Monticello, but also elsewhere in this community. So thank you for listening this morning. I will now take a few questions. If you could please ensure that your question is a question, that would be great. I think we have time for 3 questions, so we'll do that. Yes?
Hi, thank you for that. I guess the question I have is, I personally feel there's an inherent tension between preserving and also allowing us to integrate. And the way I like languages, sometimes I think about, there's some languages that are about to die out, and there's this efforts to preserve them, but in many ways the people who had spoken those languages now benefit from having assimilated. So how do you personally sort of reconcile that tension between preserving and also allowing communities to integrate?
I think communities can integrate without assimilating, and that you can become a community that celebrates differences and elevates everyone's cultural history without making everyone's history the exact same history. So I think there's a 2-pronged approach to that. One is that we have to respect that these communities do have a heritage. And speaking of rural Black Albemarle in particular, these communities are threatened. Descendants of those communities are not able to stay in Charlottesville because there's not enough opportunity to sustain them. They have to go elsewhere after they go to college or join the military. And as a result of that, the properties are turning over and they're no longer owned by these families, right? But that doesn't mean that their role and their contribution to this area's history should be erased. It should be celebrated. So we have to do that, but also invite people to engage that history. A lot of people who move into these neighborhoods don't care about that history or aren't aware of it. So we have to do that. And then we also have to acknowledge that the curriculum that we have in our schools misses a lot of this. And so when you start talking about Black history or Latina history or name XYZ specific, not main cis white history, right? People start to feel like you're taking away as opposed to adding. And the answer is that we're adding more history, that we can celebrate all of these different threads. Other questions?
Yes. How are people, where is the current research and the stories, where are they being archived? What are the current efforts out there this year?
For this community in particular, or broadly about African American history? Okay, so the question is, where is this history currently being collected in Charlottesville? And I would say that's a number of different places. There have been a countless number of oral history projects, and they are all over. They are in the hands of private residents. They're at the Jefferson School. They're at UVA in the archive system. They're at Monticello. They're at Highland, Montpelier. I mean, they're really dispersed widely. A lot of churches have an untapped pool of records and resources. And that was some of the stuff that I used for my master's thesis research was church records. And my church had records from 1893 on. They had initially 1870 on, but someone lost the first book, which is another struggle entirely when we talk about preserving and protecting these spaces. So I would say there are a lot of different sources that you could go to for this history in the area. In terms of local preservation, I think there are a lot of ongoing projects to at least tell a better, more complete story of our public history. Lewis Nelson is part of that work, Jelaine Schmidt, Claudrina Harold, Kevin Everson has done some films about Black history locally. The Jefferson School always is a big resource. Justin Reed at Virginia Foundation of the Humanities is working on a mapping effort to map some of these communities and to also map the formally protected historic sites that are connected with African American history. So there is a wave locally, and I would say especially in the wake of August 2017, I think people are really considering what we've lost by not coming to this sooner. We're losing that generation who's in their 80s, 90s, or even older than that, who have memory of these spaces, but we are making efforts locally. Last question. One more. Yes.
This is a little complicated. I'll try to be efficient.
Okay.
So, like, when you showed the picture of Keswick, and then you showed the picture of your grandparents' house, and I realized I have this instinct to, like, take glamour shots of your grandparents' house or something. And I don't know, like, is that some sort of white gaze or some, like, wealth that, like, influences what we think is beautiful, or is that a good instinct? And then the other part of that is I want to respect, like, having more diversity in this work, but I also want to help. In what ways can someone who is white, has those assumptions, step into this work while still respecting and not, like, trying to take over or not trying to, like, overstep?
Right. Okay, so there are two parts to this question, right? One is about, I'm just repeating it, I think, because there are some people listening. There is one question about the white gaze and being in these spaces and finding beauty in the marginalized history. And then the second question is about allyship and how to be a good ally in public history when you want to encourage diversity. So the first question about the white gaze, I think everyone has been drawn to do this at some point. I know when I travel abroad, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna take a picture of this. And then the people are like, no, we don't wanna be in that picture, you know? I went with the Charlottesville delegation to our sister city in Ghana. And what I noticed very early on is that our impulse as American people is to do everything for social media, right? Which meant we were approaching people in very inconsiderate ways, walking into their community and taking photos to say, this is our sister city. And they're also like, why are you here in my neighborhood? I'm trying to do my work this morning and you're interrupting. Also, I didn't give you permission to take a photo. And I feel like these communities often feel that way, in that people will sometimes go to, say, Keswick Vineyards or Castle Hill, and then they'll find themselves driving around through this area because it is beautiful, and they get to a little village, as a lot of people call them, and then they'll take pictures, right? And I think the key to that is to always remember that that's someone's home. You know, that is a space that is special to someone else, and maybe be more considerate in the way that we use those photos and glamorize that moment. And there's another part to that with people who have like weddings at plantations and really layered ways that people engage these landscapes. And I think it just involves a little bit more critical thinking, right? I'm not saying people shouldn't get married at a plantation and take beautiful photos, but people also have to acknowledge that plantations are ugly places in memory for a lot of people. And that is part of what's captured in the photo. The question about allyship, I think that has to do with building relationships. And for me, I always see the best allies as people who amplify the voices around them. If you're in a position to amplify community members who have been doing this work for years, do that. If you can cite their work, do it. If you can pass the mic, if people continue to come to you for questions that you think other people in the community haven't had a chance to answer for themselves and to represent their own community, you can pass the mic as well. And I think those are all good steps forward toward allyship. So thank you. And that's it.